KCF Technologies presents Industrial Transformation, Stories of Failure and Success from the Frontlines of American Manufacturing.
Welcome back. I am Jeremy Frank, and very thrilled to do another episode of the Industrial Transformation Podcast. We are continuing our theme in lean manufacturing, and we have a true expert and guru of lean manufacturing, Katie Anderson, who is a leadership coach and is also the author of a new book recently released two months ago. And the book is Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn. And it's a study on Mr. Isao Yoshino and his experiences in Toyota dating over many decades. And it's been a number one new release on Amazon, and it's meeting great reception. And I've just finished reading the book, and for good reason. It's a wonderful book, and I would just like to say welcome, Katie, and I'm just really excited to have a chance to speak with you.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm really looking forward to having the conversation.
Wonderful. So let's dive right in. The book, it's I really enjoyed reading it, and what I enjoyed about it so much is that it's very honest and detailed, and especially in the sense that I think you talk about both failure and success in very real ways that are relatable. You know, they're not necessarily glamorous or high profile, but they're the kind of things that we can relate to. I would just I would just thank you for that. I just thought it was a wonderful book. Do you have any comment? I mean, was that on purpose, or did you just end up that way because of Mr. Yoshino?
It was a combination. It definitely was intentional in terms of how I approached writing the book. I knew for sure that I wanted it to be based in stories and let the lessons come from there. To unwind a little bit, I met Mr. Yoshino when I had the pleasure of living in Japan for 18 months in 2015 and 16. And we met at a conference 6 months before, and we started meeting up. And I thought it was going to be a once in a lifetime experience that then subsequently turned out to be this really deep and meaningful relationship for both of us. And I learned he is such an honest and thoughtful, introspective person. And even from the very beginning, he allowed me to ask him questions and also write what I was learning from our conversation on the blog that I had just started writing. And over the last 6 years, as our relationship has deepened, we've gone deeper and deeper into his history and helped him remember memories and see things from a different angle. But I really have to give kudos to him for being willing to, have some pretty honest and challenging self-reflection. As you mentioned, this is not just a book about being successful as a leader. It's about the things about stumbling along the way, but how can we see failures and mistakes and challenges as an opportunity to learn and improve. And so I definitely wanted to really focus on leadership and learning and sort of the humanity of leadership, and thought that was really best done through just telling a real human story.
Yeah, I loved it. It comes through. I would say it's just such important. It's so important. It's relatable. I found it just very useful to read because it was very relatable. It's a book that it's in my mind is American Icon, is a book about
Yes.
Malala Ford during the financial crisis, which is very high pro. It's almost the opposite. It's very high profile, kind of an exciting story, but most people can't really relate to the kind of things described there. Whereas this was just it's very relatable. You can really wrap your head around being in those types of situations and understand how you could apply that in kind of your daily work. That's what I thought was so great about it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. And even Mr. Yoshino would say, he wasn't like the most senior level leader at Toyota, like a Mr. Cho, although he was working very closely with those leaders. And in some ways, he is more relatable in that way, as he was playing in many parts of his career, supporting roles to the senior leaders, and certainly had, teams reporting to him and grew in seniority, as you experienced through the book as well. But, he didn't just pop out being this, the number one executive at the organization. And we get to start with him, being a young college grad joining an organization and see his growth through a period of 4 decades, until he, ended up being a vice president and owning a significant business venture at Toyota.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I mean, just for those who haven't read the book yet, it just starts with him, being fresh out of college and going to work, in the Gemba, like at the nitty gritty of manufacturing, and he makes this big mistake, mixes the paint wrong, and it screws up a bunch of cars. Those are the kind of things. It's just so relatable because I've done stuff like that.
Yeah.
What I wanted to ask, so the first thing, because I think it's the part of what you touch on in the book that most people know about, is the NUMMI episode. So if you go to 1983 or 84, so Mr. Yoshino ran the training program in Japan to prepare American workers from GM to run a Japanese style operation in Fremont, California. Which is, I think, fascinating. Like, I don't know, I've heard various things about the NUMMI, that whole experience. But from you actually talking with him and what he did and how that worked, I'm just curious, it clearly worked. But what do you think made it work?
That's a great question, and one that we explored, through his conversations or through our conversations. And I was really curious too, the NUMMI, obviously, case study is really famous, and ultimately, what happened. It's interesting. NUMMI, the NUMMI plant is actually, just a stone's throw away from where I'm recording this, where I live here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I actually had a chance to go to NUMMI, a little over a decade ago before the plant closed down. In talking with Mr. Yoshino, he really believes that the success was the focus on people. And we explore this in the book, talking about how there were some leaders even within Toyota that believed that Mr. Yoshino and his group of he was responsible for developing, that training program. They should just tell the Americans exactly what to do. And he realized and knew from his own experiences that telling people exactly what to do was not going to really change their hearts. And what they needed to do was really provide a human experience that allowed them to have human connection and also to learn by doing, but in a supported environment. And so they paired each American team leader or group leader who was coming to the Gemba to learn in Japan with their Japanese counterpart, but not just for those 3 weeks. They did it. Those Japanese team members or the partners would then go for, I think, about 3 months to California and continue to work alongside. And as that person, the American NUMMI leader, was working in the plant, still being there to coach and develop them. And I think what actually stands out as a really sharp contrast to a story later in the book, the water ski boat experience that was a failed business venture, was that there wasn't that same level of coaching and support. Of course, there are many other factors in how the both programs were set up, but really that element of coaching and developing and not telling people exactly what to do, but helping build their capability and confidence along the way.
Yeah. It was really interesting reading that perspective on it, because I've read other things about the NUMMI experience in the NUMMI factory, but to understand just somebody who was so pivotal in making, I guess, setting the ingredients right so it could actually work. I mean, it almost seems impossible that it worked, but it did, and it's amazing. It's just so neat.
It's an incredible story. You always say, "Oh, you can't really change." I mean, NUMMI, the GM plant, was like the worst performing, worst culture, and within a year, with a totally different management approach and coaching approach and sense of clarity on how management and employees were going to work together, it just totally transformed the organization. And it's pretty powerful.
I was curious. I wanted to ask one thing. I mean, when I was reading the book, I was actually kind of intrigued to read about some of the real inside stories, and you actually stayed away from them. But I've heard just some crazy stories about, when that plant was running as a GM plant, as the worst GM plant, and just crazy stories of, people like falling asleep, drinking, drugs, like all this crazy stuff. And I was actually, as I read it, I was actually glad that, those things are almost gratuitous. They're interesting, but they're not purposeful. I was curious, did you do that on purpose? Did you stay away from those things, or did you? I would have to imagine you learned some of those interesting stories in talking with him.
Yes. So all of the book is really told from Mr. Yoshino's direct experiences. And then I augment that with, some context for people to have so that maybe if they didn't know about what Numi was, they could at least still read the story and have that context. But Mr. Yoshino's experience with these Americans was not them sabotaging. They came to learn. And so he knows those stories from hearsay as well. But his experience of them being in Japan to learn was not that. And actually he talked to me about that. And I think we mentioned in the book a little bit that people had this perspective that when the Americans would come, they'd still be showing up in this sort of negative way. But really, because the Japanese leaders at Toyota and the trainers greeted them with such respect and treated them with respect from the beginning, they showed up being respectful as well. And it really just shows if we show up in a really confrontational way, we have results that are more confrontational and sort of negative. But if we can show up treating each other with respect and really seeing the humanity, again, this is this concept of respect for people and respect for humanity.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was really shocked to read that. I think I mentioned when we talked a few weeks ago that we were actually in my co-founder, Professor Koopman, and I were in Japan in the year 2000, which ultimately led to us starting the company. And so we just got to live there for a while and experience some of the culture, the Japanese culture. But it is just it's just really fascinating, amazing, and wonderful that worked.
Yes.
And it just shows you that it can happen. It's people are able to change much more than you might think that they would be able to. Is I think my takeaway.
Absolutely. And I think, the very last part of the book before we go into the conclusion is talking about how the two pillars of the Toyota Way, which has been translated by Toyota itself as continuous improvement and respect for people, actually misses some richness of the meaning as it's known in the Japanese characters that represent those words. And what we say respect for people actually is respect for humanity. And I really see that goes so much deeper. It's like the core of what makes us humans. And so it's not just I respect you because you're a leader or more senior than I am, but I respect you because you are a person. And I think that's just a really important nuance.
Yeah, actually, let's jump to that because that's on my list of things I wanted to talk with you about. I found that fascinating. Again, trying to learn as much as I could of the Japanese language. It's just a fascinating language. I mean, every language is fascinating, I guess.
Yeah.
But the whole idea. In fact, I was just talking a bit earlier about just reading your description of how it's hard to capture the essence of terminology in Japanese and translate it into English. It made me think of my favorite author is Fyodor Dostoevsky. And it actually made me want to learn Russian so I could actually read that in Russian. And I probably never will, but it's I just thought that was such an interesting thing because I mean, we work with Toyota a lot and we talk about respect for people, but to go back and read from his point of view that was actually broader than that because he was there. I mean, he was there when they were defining it. I actually wrote, my note was value and respect humanity. Mm-hmm. Is what that's how I summarized the paragraph. How would you, I guess you just phrased it. It's, I mean, what else would you add to that you take away that's different than what people normally talk about in lean circles?
I think we tend to just throw out respect for people, and that gets confused. So Mr. Yoshino clarified for me, and I shared this in the book, that, there's sort of like two different types of respect. And I mentioned this a bit earlier, that you can have respect for someone because they're in a particular role, or like, we talk to children, respect your elders. So that is a different level it's a different type of respect versus this respect that really comes down to the humanness of all of us and leading with kindness, and not just because you have a certain title, but because you are, you're a person or you're a living being. And I think it's much richer, and it gets to concepts of like kindness and love and support in a different way than just, I respect you and I maybe will be compliant because you're my leader and you're telling me something, versus you respect me as a person. And I can tell that you're also providing the support, not just the challenge that you've issued, but that you're there to support and develop me along the way. I think what's really interesting too, from my experience of both living in Japan for a year and a half, and also I loved learning the language as well, and talking with Mr. Yoshino over the last 6 years, is really understanding how Toyota's culture is not synonymous with Japanese culture. Of course, there are elements of Japanese culture that has greatly influenced it, and things that are in contrast to maybe our cultures in the West. But the typical Japanese culture is very hierarchical, where, I would tell people that in Japan that I'm studying Toyota, and it's a great coaching culture where, the people-centered and leader as coach, and they'd say, wow, that is not their experience with other Japanese companies, where people they've been trained to look to the leader for all the answers, and sort of creativity and innovation has been dampened. And I see that Toyota in some ways leveraged the hierarchy of Japanese culture, but then inverted it. And so there is still that hierarchy, but it's really around how does like the next manager, the next up, really develop what Mr. Yoshino says, that chain of learning rather than the chain of telling. And so you go to Japan, and you've probably had this experience. Not all companies are like Toyota. And so it's, I think, important for us to remember that distinction.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll come back, because I also want to talk about the continuous improvement pillar, but let's jump to that, because so you talking about in 1979, I think it was the Kenru Noriyuki part of his career. And I think it's easy for me to think about Toyota now and think, the way that they are has always been that way. But in fact, the whole idea of like telling a clear story on an A3, piece of paper, and, the way that they set targets and the way that they create opportunities for leaders to develop, those things were to some extent going off the rails in the mid 70s for Toyota. And then they did a course correction. So it's not like, at least my read of that, and I'm so interested to hear more. It's not like Taiichi Ono, came down with the tablets in the 50s, and then everything worked perfectly. They had to work on this stuff just like everybody else did, and he was directly, personally involved in setting that different culture. Is that accurate?
Yes, and that's what I think also is so unique and special about Mr. Yoshino's experiences. In some ways, he says he represents all of Toyota's experiences, but he also was involved personally in some very important, pivotal times in Toyota's history, as it was intentionally creating the culture that we now sort of assume and take for granted as synonymous with Toyota. And so one of those times was the Conpro program in the late 1979, 1980, where the Toyota leadership, following the oil crisis in the 70s and sort of, 15, 20 years after they had really been focused on the quality circles and had gotten the Deming Award in the 1960s, management, as Mr. Yoshino says, realized they needed to tighten the belt and get serious again about nurturing the management capabilities that they thought were most important. And by leadership, I mean the president and the president's executive team. And that's where the Conpro program was created out of. And it was a 2-year program. And they used A3 thinking, the process of A3, and doing Hoshin Conry strategy deployment, not just for managing operational problems, but also for managers to clearly indicate what role they were going to have in coaching and developing their team members to achieve the targets. And Mr. Yoshino considers that 2-year program that he was one of like a handful of people intimately involved with supporting as the critical force that established A3 as a standard communication tool and method across Toyota. And in fact, John Shook, who then just a few years later during the Numing training program reported to Mr. Yoshino, John Shook's written a book that really introduced A3 thinking in many ways to the Western world called Managing to Learn. he used Mr. Yoshino and Mr. Yoshino's assistant manager, who was John's actual direct manager, as the model for what a leader or a manager at Toyota looks like in terms of setting direction and then providing that coaching support to develop an A3.
Absolutely. I'd like to hear you. One of the lessons that I took in my notes through that part is the no problem is a problem.
Mm.
Basically like an open embrace of issues so that you can work with them. So rather than, accusing subordinates of failing to meet the expectation, you're basically welcoming the awareness of problems so that you can then work on them. It's useful news. Can you talk about that a little bit more too?
Sure, and that's a phrase that Mr. Yoshino's repeated from day one. It's one of his mantras, and I suppose it's one of the mantras of Toyota too. And that goes in hand with like a no blame culture too. So if you want people to feel comfortable with bringing forward problems or challenges or things not going to plan, you also need to be there to not blame them, but look at the process instead. And he would say that if we don't have visibility to the things that aren't going well, then we don't have the opportunity to actually work on them and improve them. And we're sort of, brushing them all under the carpet, but we know that those things are still existing and they're actually going to impact the outcomes that we eventually see, and not necessarily in the good way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm curious. I'm going to ask you to just conjecture a bit, and I don't know. Feel free if this is outside of your direct experience, but it's also just I'm interested just to hear your conjecture and your opinion. So if you fast forward to the present, technology is changing very quickly. Industry 4.0, industrial Internet of Things. There's this massive wave of technology that's hitting every industrial manufacturing site, and despite the success of the NUMMI experience, a company like GM, in some ways, is still struggling with some of the same things they were struggling with 30 years ago. And I'm curious what you see, both looking at Toyota, how they embrace or use all this new technology, and then also a company like GM, and especially thinking about those experiences in Japan where it's clearly possible for people to change, like reorient themselves and commit to doing things in a more lean-minded way. And hypothetically, technology provides a path to do that more expeditiously. Can you comment on either or both of those?
So this will be total conjecture on my on my end as well. So since I'm not working at Toyota, and certainly have never worked at GM either. But one of the things I see Toyota doing really successfully is really continuing that focus on people and leverage. Where can they leverage and highlight people's special capabilities, and then use technology to support that as well. And again, Toyota has, they have their manufacturing side, but they also have areas devoted to innovation and technology as well. So when we say Toyota, it's we often think of just the automobile manufacturing part, but there's so much more as well in terms of how they're ideating and using technology to support the production. But again, if you go to Toyota, you still see on the line it's mainly people there doing the final assembly. They use technology and automation for the parts that really can be routinized and standardized, but they want people to be there to use their creativity to continuously improve on other areas. And I don't know, I've read books about GM, of course, too, and what they took or didn't take from that NUMMI experience. But I would imagine it's the same case as many of us, that we focused more on the tools and the outcomes rather than really the deeply fundamental process or the fundamental truth of Toyota, as Yoshino would say, is that there's no secret to Toyota except its attitude towards learning. And learning still requires this human element. Of course, we can have AI learning as well, and it'll be really interesting to see how we use artificial intelligence to help increase our learning as individuals and as organizations. But it's not just about the outcome. It's about the learning experience through that as well. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but those are some thoughts that come to my mind right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are great thoughts, and it definitely resonates. I mean, I think especially the fact that it's the focus always is on the people, elevating people, and then finding ways for the technology to support the people. That that
Yeah.
definitely resonates with everything I've observed. And yeah, it paints a very promising picture, frankly. So it also that I want to come back to the pillars because the other one that there was a distinction about was just kaizen, continuous improvement. But like as I kind of read what you wrote, I wrote wisdom and continuous improvement, which I think is pretty interesting because it's sort of like establishing knowledge or wisdom as being valuable in and of itself, whether you make good cars or not. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And actually, as we were talking, I was thinking too, this was a nice segue to go back to the concept of continuous improvement in the other pillar, because, there's this sense of humanity that comes with wisdom, that we can do improvement with technology as well. But wisdom really, to me, speaks to a sort of a human element as well. So this was an interesting discovery too. And actually, Mr. Yoshino, he had never noticed it before. But Michel Baudin was at a session that we had a few years ago here in San Francisco, and we were talking about the Toyota Way 2001. And Michel speaks and reads Japanese fluently, and asked Mr. Yoshino, can you comment on why the Japanese characters under the pillar of continuous improvement, even in the Toyota document, says wisdom and Kaizen, Chie to Kaizen, whereas they translated in English just as continuous improvement. And so you can see some of my response, or Mr. Yoshino's response in the book there. And I think we get to this interesting element that we miss this nuance with this concept of continuous. Yes, we're always learning, and maybe that's where knowledge becomes wisdom. But to me, the word wisdom in English conveys so much more than just continuous improvement. And so there's an element there that really gets back and connected to that concept of humanity. And I wanted to highlight one other thing too, getting back to the ConPro program and how that was sort of 20 years after Toyota was really focusing on its quality improvement initiatives. Then they worked on ConPro to really shore up the management capabilities. And again, about 20 years later, that's when the Toyota Way 2001 was codified. And it's almost like these 20-year cycles having to put renewed energy and focus into supporting and, Yoshino would say, retightening the belt on the culture and how it's getting translated through the generational learning and maintaining that wisdom. And maybe that's where, I'm just thinking out loud, maybe that's part of where that concept of wisdom comes as well. It's like, how do you pass that down generation to generation, and in an organization, sort of that leadership of chain of learning?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just think it's fascinating that piece of it was somehow either intentionally or unintentionally lost in translation. But that, I mean, you come back to the kind of the idea of lean merging with these industry 4.0 capabilities, and you mentioned AI. I don't know if the real AI people would say this, but I don't think AI can create wisdom.
Right.
It can create facts and it can create insights, maybe.
That knowledge.
But wisdom is fundamentally a human thing, probably.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And right. So I think that's where we retain that humanity, the human element that makes us so unique. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I mean, it definitely supports, as we work with, people from lots of different parts of the auto sector and these other industrial sectors. It's just something we continually experience. It's just all about the people. The technology supports what the people do. But yeah, dialing it back to wisdom, it just really sets an elevated, like a lofty goal. I really like that. So let me ask you a question, if I may, because I like to I like to keep things consistent and kind of focus on the same couple of questions in each of these themes that we pursue. And The first one is maybe as a problem, and I mean we haven't really talked about the failure, the really interesting failure in creating a Toyota water ski boat business, which I didn't even know about that. I didn't know that had ever happened until I read the book.
I know. I don't think many people would.
Yeah, it's fascinating that Toyota's wonderful, but Toyota makes mistakes too, and people make mistakes. But I'm not, I think we could relate it to that. Well, actually, let me start there before I move on to that. Is there anything about that episode that you think is particularly noteworthy in the context of what we talked about to share with the listeners?
Well, again, just to provide some context so people know what we're talking about. In the 80s, Toyota established a department that encouraged like sort of new business ventures to be explored, and knowing that they weren't always going to be successful. So Mr. Yoshino had an idea for an American market, for in the American market, to do water ski boats using the Lexus motor and creating sort of a high-end sort of Lexus grade water ski boat. And he was put in charge of this venture ultimately, and it failed, and he lost the company $13 million. And I think what's notable about it is, one, that Toyota is willing to make experiments, or undergo experiments and explore new ideas. So not just automobiles and staying in their bread and butter, but always looking at other things that they may be able to do, and took responsibility for the failure. And this goes back to the same, experience Mr. Yoshino had in his orientation when the paint, the paint story where he put the wrong paint and 100 cars had to be repainted. And his manager thanked him for making the mistake, because they had now an opportunity to improve the working conditions and better label the environment. And in this case, Mr. Cho acknowledged that the company too had played a significant role. It wasn't just Mr. Yoshino who failed, but the company had some failures too. And they are all new to this boat business, and they were learning. And so just really back to the concept of learning, but he wasn't like thrown out on the street and fired at the end of his career just because of this, this failure. He was put into a new role, and where he could leverage his learning from that experience.
Yeah, I appreciate what I would add to that, though, Katie, too. What I so appreciated about the book and the story that you and he told together is that, I've been doing entrepreneurship for 20 years, and people sometimes talk about failure or fast failure or pivoting. And until you've actually really experienced failure, it's easy to underrate how the painfulness of the failure. Like I could read that, that even it's 15, 20, 25 years later, when you were talking with him, you were kind of uncovering these skeletons from the closet, that
Oh, yeah.
you're like, yes, they'd acknowledge that it wasn't, that it was a good learning experience, but it was still painful for him 20, 25 years later. And I think that's just very real, very honest.
Absolutely. He always, since I've met him, talked about, mentioned the water ski boat failure, but really didn't go into much depth with it. And it, even just up until a few months ago, and even just a few weeks before the book was published, some new things came out. But it was a really, really hard time for him to talk about. And really, the story that you read in the book was uncovered through many, many months and actually years of conversation. And for a while, he wasn't really wanting to talk about it. He almost looked gray. He was willing to talk to me about anything, but he had this, it was really special. This one moment where one of our video calls, he just all of a sudden looked happy and cheerful. And he said it was like this weight had been removed from him, or this is my interpretation of his words. He could see his failure and the things he was really kind of beating himself up over in a new light, and with a different perspective through the questions and sort of me trying to piece together the story. So it wasn't that he wasn't owning the things that he had done wrong, or maybe not as good as he would have liked to, but it removed that burden from him. And so if anything, I think that opportunity to help him see his failures and his successes in a different light was really valuable to me and very rewarding.
Yeah, I think it was. Thank you for writing about that and just getting that story, because I think it's just so relatable. Because we've all been there in different ways. I think it's just great.
What I think
So
is
let me
really,
ask you. I'm
sorry, I
sorry,
just
go
want to
ahead.
say what I find also really interesting about that story too is like, you know, we, in the best of times, we can all lead really well. But, you know, when things are stressful and you feel like things are like flailing or, you know, going down, or you're just stressed with time, you know, even we may not do the things that we know we should be doing as leaders and as managers. And, you know, Mr. Yoshino fell into that same case. The guy who basically taught all of Toyota executives how to do strategy deployment, Hoshin Kanri, then like didn't do it himself in the way that he knew he should because he felt too pressed for time. And so I just think it's a really human story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just so relatable. There were 3 or 4 different things I've done that I could relate to, just like that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. So I do. We're getting kind of to past the time, but this is a fascinating discussion. I want to ask a couple questions in wrapping up. And the first one, it kind of relates to this, but take it as you would like to. So you've written this book. You're practicing leadership coaching and lean, and you're surely encountering all kinds of problems. You know, whether it's the failure of some business or the failure of leadership in some organization or at the individual level. And what I would like to ask you is, what is it, if you could just snap your fingers and solve something and have, I don't know, you wouldn't want to have failures not happen, because failures are learning experiences, but what is it that you would like to be able to eradicate as a problem as it relates to the experiences in this book or just in your career?
That's a big question. I've one that requires more pondering and thought, but I'll probably come back to you with some other thoughts on this. But the first thing that really jumps out to me is how we as humans have so much the habit of telling and advocating for our own thoughts and ideas, and how limiting that is in creating and cultivating learning for others and learning within our organizations. And across the board, both with me working in organizations when I was working in the corporate world, or in healthcare environments as well, and now consulting and coaching leaders and organizations, I think I've experienced that our habit of telling gets in our way so much. And of course, there's a role for telling and setting direction, but we have a complete imbalance as humans, especially as adult humans, I should say, in telling so much, and we're not even aware of it. Sometimes we think we're asking a question, but it's really a question disguised, or our idea disguised as a question. And so, what I would like to wave the magic wand is to create more awareness for everyone about what's coming out of our mouth, and when asking a better question would actually serve us more in the long run than running around sort of telling everyone what to do. And I really think that's the heart of developing a learning culture.
Yeah, I love that answer, Katie. I mean, it wasn't in my notes, but I remember that part of his story, like early in the career, just specifically learning how to ask patient, humble questions. That it reminds me of that. It's fascinating. Yeah. So question number 2, do you think it's possible? So if you take it out to the 10 years from now, do you think, either with that or with just generally in the manufacturing world, in the industrial world, in the leadership world, do you think it's possible? Like, how do you think people can become more humble, or something else? Like, what do you think? What do you look to when you look 10 years out or further in a positive sense?
Do you mean, do I think people can be more humble? Sorry, can you?
Yeah. Do you think? I mean, so maybe just in that specific context, if you had a magic wand, people would be better at listening and better at asking genuine questions, and rather than telling people what to do or just jamming their ideas downward.
So
Do you think things are getting better? Is really my question.
Well, so I'll go. I don't know. I don't know if things are getting better, but I hope they are. I hope we're always getting better. to me, that always gets back to this concept of purpose. And this is, when I work with individuals or leadership teams, I say, like, first draw your purpose. Like, what are the most important things to you? Identify that, not just from a professional side, but from your whole life. And it always comes down to like people and helping others and connecting and making the world better. And so if we can hold on to that purpose, then we can better align our behaviors with that purpose. So, we want to help people improve. We want our organization to succeed. We want to be better. So it's about staying connected with that purpose and then creating some self-awareness about how our actions and the words that we say either are aligning or not aligning with that purpose. And I actually call that leading with intention, because, Japanese, there's the word intention in Japanese is made up of partially of a symbol that means heart and the other one meaning direction. And to me, it's about leading with intentions, about understanding what's important for you inside or what you want to be achieving. And then how are you orienting and aligning your behaviors in that direction? And so I think if we can connect with purpose and create some self-awareness, we're really going to be able to move in that direction of making the world better.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I mean, also, again, telling these stories from Toyota, you look at, respecting humanity and, wisdom and continuous improvement, as those point you in the right direction. I think, that's one of the things that's so remarkable about Toyota. Last question I do have,
Okay.
we're running out of time, but I know that these questions are intentionally a little, just thought provoking, because I really like to hear, you're an expert in this area, and I like to hear what you really think. This question is kind of about your own thinking, and it is, can you share with us something that you know to be true or believe to be true that's divergent, meaning that most people don't yet agree with you about this thing that you know to be true? What would you say that is for you?
Oh my gosh, that's a question that requires some deeper thinking too. It's a hard question to answer immediately, because I think it's a really great question. I don't know if it's something that other people don't know to be true, but maybe are not as connected with it. And to me, it goes back to exactly what we were just talking about, is that sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as well, but that in the long run, we achieve more by slowing down and asking more questions. And in the busyness of our lives, or the sense of urgency of all the things we need to do, or the crises happening in our organizations, we revert to this sense of like just telling to be more expedient to get it done. But in reality, if we could slow down and ask more questions and think more deeply, we'll be more effective at sort of solving problems at the root cause, and also sort of distributing creativity across our organizations. And so this is something that I don't know if others would disagree with me on per se, but maybe aren't always bringing this forward to their awareness as well. And it's something I have to be really intentional about each and every day. I mean, even with my family, it's like, how do I ask more questions? How do I slow down a little bit and not feel so overwhelmed by all the things that are happening here? Because I know ultimately, to achieve my purpose, I will be more effective if I can be slower, think more deeply, and help others do the same.
Yeah, I think that's very enlightening. People may not think that they disagree with you, but we do in our behaviors.
Right.
I think I've probably done that 3 times today. I'm just reflecting.
It's hard, man.
Choosing expediency over patience, and really learning and relying on others. Yeah, that's very very thoughtful.
Thanks for the thought-provoking questions.
Well, you're very welcome. I like to ask that last question particularly because it forces you to really think about the kind of the way that you see the world, and I think that's just a wonderful answer. That well, I would ask. We do need to wrap up. We're out of our time allotment, but I would just ask Katie: is there anything else that you would like to share with the industrial transformation audience before we end?
Sure. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing, questions or comments from any of you. You can contact me either through the book's website, which is simple. It's learningtolead.com, or my own website, which is KBJ Anderson. My maiden name was Brian Jones, so my initials are KBJA. And I really love connecting with people around the world. And so I look forward to hearing from you. And please read the books and learn from Mr. Yoshino, or the book, and learn from Mr. Yoshino's wisdom as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And this is just a fantastic book. I think it's going to gain a lot of acceptance for all the reasons we've talked about. So thank you for writing it. Thank you for spending that time and gathering those stories. And also thanks for being on the Industrial Transformation Podcast. This is Jeremy Frank, and thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Industrial Transformation Podcast, a production of Business Builders Media. Learn more about how KCF can help you on your industrial transformation journey at kcftech.com, and check out more shows on businessbuildersmedia.com.